George Washington loved drinking booze, man.
Totally, dude. He loved getting hammered.
You too stupid?
Have you ever heard of the Whiskey Rebellion? God, I'm friends with idiots. Washington, hated booze, dude. That was, the whole point of the Whiskey Rebellion, I think.
Actually, Jackson, the Whiskey Rebellion was a much more complex situation than you're making it out to be. It was a crucial moment in early American history.
How the fuck did you get in my house, and how do you know my name?
In fact, I would love to explain to you all how President George Washington and his administration's response to the Whiskey Rebellion was directly influenced by Secretary Alexander Hamilton in an effort to expand federal authority and protect a fragile constitution in its infancy.
Seriously, who the fuck is this? How'd he get in the house?
To understand the Whiskey Rebellion, we first must understand how this event came to be.
In the years following the American Revolution, the newly formed nation was suffering from financial hardships. The United States had compiled an immense amount of debt from the war efforts. One man felt as though he had the answers to solving this pressing issue of debt: Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. In 1790, Secretary Hamilton released the Report on Public Credit. This report urged the government to combine the individual states' debts into one large national debt in an effort to combat the weakened economy. The plan was approved, leaving Hamilton and the government with questions on how to raise money to pay off the newly increased national debt. One of the plans was created by Hamilton, the whiskey excise tax of 1791. The 1791 excise law set a varying 6 to 18 cent per gallon tax rate, with smaller distillers often paying more than twice per gallon what larger producers paid. All payments had to be made in cash to the federal revenue officer appointed for the distiller's county. However, this plan affected the frontier population, especially those located in western Pennsylvania, who heavily relied on whiskey in their local economies. They petitioned against the government and Hamilton. Petitioners had argued that such an internal tax posed a threat to liberty and to their local economies. Despite the pleas from the frontiersmen and citizens of Pennsylvania, the excise tax went into effect. The citizens of the region were enraged and began protesting. They held animosity towards public officials, especially the tax collectors. One such man was named John Neville. Neville was regional supervisor for collection of the federal excise tax in western Pennsylvania. On July 17, 1794, John Neville's home was surrounded by protesters demanding his resignation. When Neville refused, conflict broke out, resulting in the death of one protester. The next day, hundreds of protesters returned to Neville's home and burnt it to the ground. The violence at the Neville household led to discussions by prominent members of the community. People such as David Bradford, Hugh Henry Brackenridge, and William Finley led these debates. Hundreds of other community members continued the protests, which eventually led to discussions of interventions. The primary culprit responsible for these discussions was Secretary Hamilton. On August 2, 1794, Hamilton wrote a letter addressed to President Washington urging for military intervention. In his letter, he writes, "Armed collections of men, with the avowed design of opposing the execution of the laws, have attacked the house of the Inspector of the Revenue, burnt and destroyed his property, and shed the blood of persons engaged in its defense." Hamilton would continue his urges by pushing for the Militia Act to be used to squash the rebellion forming in western Pennsylvania. President Washington, however, did not have such an aggressive desire. In a letter to Henry Lee, Washington writes, "Many of their bodies, I have no doubt, mean well, but know little of the real plan." Washington acknowledged the way the rebels would feel and would later acknowledge regret over the situation. Despite these worries, Washington would take action after the release of the Tolley Letters. The Tolley Letters were written by an unknown citizen, writing under the pseudonym Tully. These letters were addressed to the American people and argued in favor of the excise tax and a strong response from the federal government. These elegantly written letters were influential and placed the pressure back on President Washington to respond to the rebellion in Pennsylvania.
Wait. Who's Tully? It's a great question, Adam. Tully was actually Mr. Alexander Hamilton himself.
Seriously, how are we just ignoring him teleporting right in front of us?
Jackson, shut up! Let the president speak.
Alexander Hamilton wrote the Tully Letters in an effort to put pressure on the Washington administration and garner support for not only the whiskey excise tax, but a military response to the Whiskey Rebellion. A conference on August 2nd was held with Washington and his cabinet members, with the leaders of the Pennsylvania government, such as Governor Thomas Mifflin, Chief Justice Thomas McKean, Attorney General Jared Ingersoll, and Secretary of the Commonwealth Alexander J. Dallas. The federal government and the Pennsylvania government failed to come to an agreement. President Washington would hold various meetings and receive correspondences from Hamilton over the course of August 1794. Washington knew he had to respond, but was attempting one last deal at peace. He urged for peace in a proclamation released on August 7th. However, after negotiations fell through in late August, President Washington ordered for the gathering of 15,000 troops and to march on the rebelling counties in western Pennsylvania. The members of the rebellion, seeing the size of the approaching army, surrendered without violent opposition. Arrests were made, many of which under the urging of Secretary Hamilton. In one account, Hamilton was awaiting in person Hugh Henry Brackenridge. Brackenridge wrote in his account, "I was received by Hamilton with that countenance which a man will have when he sees a person with regard to whom his humanity and his sense of justice struggles. He would have him saved, but is afraid he must be hanged." President Washington would later regret the arrests of these rebels and would order for Brackenridge and many other leaders to be pardoned. However, Hamilton had won the push for increased federal authority. Historian Richard Cohn summarized Hamilton's perspective and the impact of the Whiskey Rebellion best in the conclusion of his article, The Washington Administration's Decision to Crush the Whiskey Rebellion. He said, quote, "The rebellion has long been interpreted as a milestone in the creation of federal authority, and in most respects that is its chief significance. Certainly to the Federalists, who had long been striving for a strong national government, it was a major test. The new government successfully crushed organized and violent resistance to the laws. As Hamilton put it, the rebellion would do us a great deal of good and add to the solidity of everything in this country."
In conclusion, Alexander Hamilton was a key influence over the Washington administration's response to the Whiskey Rebellion as a matter of federal authority and to protect a fragile constitution, one that would influence the rights of the government to this very day.
Wow. Thank you, President Washington. That truly is an important part of American history.
I agree. I wish more people knew about this. Thank you.
Sorry you like the president, even are you?
Some things are better left unanswered, Jackson.